Hello, and welcome back to another quiet evening together. I'm really glad you're here tonight because what I've put together is something I've been genuinely looking forward to sharing for a while now. It touches on one of those topics that seems simple and a little amusing on the surface, but the longer you sit with it, the deeper and stranger and more genuinely interesting it becomes. And I think of all the things to think about on a night when you want your mind to drift somewhere comfortable but curious, this might be one of the better choices I've found. We're going to be talking about South Park tonight, but not in the way you might expect. This isn't a video about the humor or the controversies or the animation style or any of the usual things that come up when people discuss that show. What we're looking at tonight is something that lives in the space between South Park, the television program, and the actual real world around it. A pattern that surfaces again and again over the course of nearly 3 decades of that show, where something that began as a joke inside that cartoon, a throwaway line, a satirical premise, a gag that aired on a Wednesday night and seemed to be forgotten by the weekend, turned out to be describing something that would actually happen in the real world, sometimes months later, sometimes a full decade later. Sometimes with an accuracy so specific and so detailed that it becomes genuinely difficult to explain away as coincidence when you see all of it laid out in one place. Now, I want to set the right tone here at the very start, all because this isn't a video meant to alarm you or send you down a conspiratorial rabbit hole. Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the two people who created and have run South Park since 1997, are not oracles. They're not receiving transmissions from the future. They're not part of some network of hidden information that the rest of us don't have access to. What they are, and this is the genuinely interesting part, is extraordinarily attentive. They pay attention to the world in a specific way, a relentless, weekly, almost obsessive way that most people simply don't have the time or the inclination to sustain for long. And that kind of attention, it turns out, can sometimes see the shape of things before those things fully arrive. It can trace the line a trend is drawing before the line reaches its destination. So settle in, and find your most comfortable position, let the lights stay low, and let's move through all of this slowly. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, and there is genuinely no rush. These are the kinds of stories that reward patience, that feel better absorbed gradually than hurried through. When we're done, my hope is that you'll have that quiet, particular satisfaction of having spent time with something that gave back more than it seemed to promise at the start. That's what the best evenings are for, I think. Before we get into any specific predictions, I want to spend real time with the story of how South Park actually operates as a production, because I genuinely believe that without understanding this part, the predictions don't make the kind of sense they should. The mechanics of how the show is made are the explanation for why the pattern exists. And once you understand the mechanics, everything else we talk about tonight becomes not just interesting, but coherent. South Park premiered on Comedy Central on August 13th, 1997. It was created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, two friends who had grown up in Colorado and who had, somewhat improbably, managed to convert a crude animated short film called The Spirit of Christmas into a full network television deal. The show was set in a fictional small mountain town in Colorado, clearly inspired by the real landscape and real small town culture that Parker and Stone had grown up inside. And it followed 4 elementary school boys named Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, through stories that were simultaneously ridiculous and sharp, but crude in a way that somehow felt precise rather than random, and conspicuously willing to skewer absolutely everyone regardless of political affiliation or cultural standing. The first episode aired to almost instant controversy and to remarkable ratings for a new show on a cable network. For the first few seasons, South Park operated more or less the way other animated shows operated, with scripts developed months in advance and a production timeline that allowed for deliberate, methodical crafting of each individual episode. But starting around season 4, in the year 2000, Parker and Stone made a decision that would change the show permanently and set it apart from every other animated series in the history of American television. They decided to produce each episode in approximately 6 days. Let me just hold that number for a moment because it is worth really absorbing before you move on from it. 6 days? From the first conversation about what that week's episode might be about to the finished product being broadcast on television. In that same period of time, a standard animated show like The Simpsons or Family Guy is somewhere in roughly the first week of what will ultimately be a 9-month production pipeline. South Park compresses the entire process, the writing, the voice recording, the animation, the editing, the sound design, every piece of it, into less than a single week. The way the cycle works, at least as it was documented in a behind-the-scenes film released in 2011 called 6 Days to Air, The Making of South Park, goes roughly like this. The writing process begins on Thursday morning when Trey Parker sits down with a small group of writers and they start talking about what they want to respond to that particular week. And the key word there is respond, not plan, not execute against a previously developed outline. Respond. What happened this week? What is everyone arguing about right now? What story just broke? What cultural moment is happening in real time? Once a direction is chosen, Parker writes the actual script himself. This typically involves extraordinary hours and very little sleep. From there, a production team of approximately 70 people, including animators, voice actors, editors, sound engineers, and post-production specialists, begin working schedules that can only be described as genuinely brutal. The finished episode is transmitted to Comedy Central via satellite on Wednesday evening, sometimes arriving at the network just a matter of hours before the 10 o'clock broadcast begins. This production model carries obvious risks. Things can go wrong, the script can break down in the middle of the week, the animation can fall behind. An episode can simply not come together the way it needed to. Parker and Stone have spoken openly in interviews about weeks where they genuinely weren't certain they would have something to deliver. But it also carries an advantage that no other show in the history of American television can claim. South Park never talks about last month. It never revisits a conversation from last year. It talks about this week. Whatever's in the news as of Thursday morning, whatever argument people are having right now, whatever strange or alarming or absurd thing just happened in politics or celebrity culture or technology or sports or science, South Park is in a room on Thursday trying to figure out how to put it on a cartoon that airs on Wednesday. And here's what that does to a person over time. When you engage with the present this closely, this consistently, week after week, year after year, for nearly 3 decades, you develop something that I can only describe as a kind of deep cultural fluency. You start to hear not just the surface of what's being said in a given cultural moment, but the rhythm underneath it. You recognize patterns not because you predicted anything, but because you've seen similar patterns form and resolve enough times to develop a real intuition about their shape. You start to feel sometimes the direction something is moving before it's moved all the way there. And when you're also a satirist by trade, when your job is to find the absurd logic inside real events and follow that logic to wherever it leads, the place it leads is sometimes somewhere that reality hasn't caught up to yet. There's a discipline embedded in good satire that I think gets overlooked in casual discussions of what satire does. When you satirize something well, you don't just mock its surface. You have to understand its internal logic deeply enough to exaggerate it coherently. You have to know what it would look like if it went further, if it became more fully and unambiguously itself. And going further is very often exactly where reality eventually goes. The satirist who follows a trend honestly to its absurd conclusion in year 1 is, not infrequently, describing year 5 with uncomfortable accuracy. Not because they predicted the future in any mystical sense, because they understood the present clearly enough to see where it was already pointed. Parker and Stone have done this with a consistency and across a variety of subjects that, when you lay it out all in one place, starts to feel like a coherent and documented phenomenon rather than a series of coincidences. The predictions span politics and celebrity culture and technology and food safety and corporate behavior and media psychology. They span time gaps of a single year and time gaps of 15 years. They occur in the central premise of episodes and in throwaway background jokes that nobody paid attention to when they aired. The specificity is part of what makes the pattern so striking. These aren't vague gestures toward general trends. Many of them are remarkably, precisely exact. The show's commitment to this quality of cultural observation has been formally recognized. In 2005 and 2006, the Peabody Award Committee gave South Park its award for distinguished and biting social commentary, acknowledging the show's consistent precision in engaging with the cultural moment. The show has won 5 Primetime Emmy Awards for Outstanding Animated Program. It received an Academy Award nomination in the year 2000 for the song Blame Canada, which was written for the show's theatrical film, South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. And in July of 2025, Parker & Stone signed a new deal with Paramount Global worth $1.5 billion that guarantees 50 new episodes and secures the show's continuation through at least the end of this decade. As of this recording, South Park has run for 28 seasons and 338 episodes, making it one of the longest-running animated series in American history. But tonight, the records and the awards are just backdrop. What we're here for is the pattern. And there's no better place to start than with the most famous example of it, because it's the one that established for most people who follow this topic the sense that what South Park does with cultural observation is something genuinely unusual. September 23, 2015. A Wednesday night on Comedy Central, Season 19, Episode 2. The episode is called Where My Country Gone, and in all the years of South Park's history up to that point, it may be the single episode that, looking back with what we now know, feels most uncomfortably like someone sitting across from you and telling you exactly what is about to happen to the world. To feel the full weight of this, you need to remember the specific atmosphere of September 2015. Donald Trump had announced his candidacy for the Republican presidential nomination in June of that year, and the dominant response from the political establishment and the media was a mixture of amusement and dismissal. This was the consensus understanding: a spectacle, a media moment, a stunt that would generate ratings for the early debates but would eventually burn itself out before anything consequential happened. Even within the Republican Party, the campaign was widely viewed as an anomaly that the system would naturally correct. The mood in that particular political autumn was one of entertainment mixed with mild unease. And it's that precise mixture that Parker & Stone picked up and put on screen. The show, writing in real time in the late summer and early fall of 2015, built the second episode of Season 19 around 2 things that were deeply alive in the political conversation at that exact moment: political correctness as a cultural phenomenon and immigration. These were the 2 most raw and combustible subjects in the political air. And the episode chose to tell its immigration story using Canada as the lens. In the episode, the town of South Park is overwhelmed by Canadian immigrants, all of them arriving in visible distress, all of them having fled their country. The reason they fled comes out over the course of the episode. During the most recent Canadian election, a loud, brash, reality television-style politician ran for President of Canada, a position that doesn't exist in real Canadian governance, but which serves the story's purposes perfectly. This candidate ran on a platform of aggressive nationalism, outrage, and a complete rejection of conventional political behavior. He was spectacle. He was entertainment. His campaign was treated as a joke by the Canadian public. People voted for him as a protest, as a provocation, as a way of expressing discontent that they assumed would never actually result in him running anything. And then he won. He won the election, and Canada became, very quickly, in somewhere his citizens didn't recognize. The refugees in the episode describe, in terms that are not subtle, what it felt like. They thought it was absurd. They thought the system would intervene. They were certain that there were safeguards, institutional or informal or simply popular, that would prevent the thing from actually happening. And there weren't. And now they are in another country trying to explain it. Meanwhile, Mr. Garrison, one of South Park's long-running teacher characters, launches his own political campaign in response to the Canadian influx. His platform is built on removal. His rhetoric is inflammatory and deliberate. His central promise is to build a wall. His campaign slogan is "Where My Country Gone," printed on a baseball cap that is an unmistakable reference. The parallels are drawn without any apparent concern for subtlety, and they were recognized immediately when the episode aired. The episode aired on September 23, 2015. Donald Trump was elected the 45th President of the United States on November 8, 2016. Approximately 14 months separated those two events. What makes Where My Country Gone so specifically resonant isn't just the election outcome, although the outcome alone would be enough. It's the mechanics of the prediction. The episode doesn't just put a Trump-like figure on screen, it dramatizes with surprising accuracy the specific psychological process by which a Trump-like figure wins. The treating of the candidacy as entertainment. The assumption that the system will self-correct, the failure of that assumption. For the refugees describing, after the fact, the moment they realized the joke had become the reality. All of that is in the episode. All of it aired 14 months before the election. All of it turned out to be an accurate description of something that was about to happen. There is a detail I find particularly illuminating about this prediction. Parker and Stone themselves did not believe Trump would win. When he actually did in November 2016, they were caught off guard. They had to hastily rewrite the finale of season 20, which had been structured around a different election outcome. They had predicted the Trump presidency through the logical structure of their satire. And then, like most of the country, they were surprised when the prediction they had built into their work came true. That detail is important. It confirms that the prediction wasn't the result of anyone having special knowledge of what was about to happen. Parker and Stone wrote the honest, logical consequence of the cultural moment they observed in September 2015, followed it to its uncomfortable conclusion inside a cartoon, and reality then followed the same path. They saw the direction clearly. They didn't necessarily choose the destination. The shadow fell where the light said it would. The episode remains, years later, one of the most analyzed and discussed in the show's long history. It's the first thing most people mention when the subject of South Park's predictive accuracy comes up. And it serves as the right starting point for tonight, because it established a framework for understanding what the rest of the examples we're going to look at have in common. The show observes honestly. It follows the logic of what it observes. And sometimes the place that logic leads is somewhere reality hasn't reached yet but will. That's the Trump prediction, probably the most famous, and as I said earlier, in some ways the most explainable. The seeds of it were already visible in September 2015 to anyone paying very close attention. What comes next is a bit different. The next example we're going to look at involves a prediction that was made in 1999 about a technology that didn't exist and a cultural phenomenon that was almost 17 years in the future. And it wasn't a central premise or a careful satirical argument. It was a background element in a joke about Japanese pop culture. It just turned out to be describing in fairly precise terms what 145 million people would do with their phones in July of 2016. November 3rd, 1999, Season 3, Episode 10. The episode is called Chin Pokemon, and at first glance it appears to be exactly what it presents itself as, a parody of Pokemon. In 1999, Pokemon was absolutely everywhere. If you were alive and conscious in any Western country during that particular autumn, you encountered it constantly. The trading cards alone had generated a kind of low-grade cultural mania in school hallways and playgrounds, with kids buying, trading, arguing about, and occasionally crying over small pieces of cardboard printed with cartoon creatures. The handheld video game was selling at a pace that had surprised everyone, including Nintendo. The animated television series was airing daily on major networks. The merchandise, the lunchboxes, the backpacks, the branded snacks and stuffed toys and board games and clothing multiplied in shop windows and in the backgrounds of children's bedrooms with what felt like organic momentum. Pokémon in 1999 was a genuine phenomenon, the kind that a show like South Park couldn't responsibly ignore. So Parker and Stone wrote Chin Pokémon, an episode about the kids of South Park becoming completely consumed by a fictional Japanese fad that is unmistakably, deliberately, and very amusingly a parody of Pokémon. The Chin Pokémon creatures are ridiculous. The branding is absurd. The way the children abandon all sense of proportion in their devotion to the fad is a pitch-perfect mirror of what was genuinely happening in schoolyards around the world. The adults in the episode are baffled, the kids are unreachable, the corporate machine behind the product is ruthless and omnipresent. It's a funny episode about a real cultural moment, and if it had stayed entirely at that level, it would still be a good episode, the way many South Park episodes that respond to specific cultural moments of their time are still good episodes. But it doesn't stay at that level. Because embedded in the satirical premise of Chin Pokémon is a detail that transforms the episode's meaning when you look at it from the other side of the next 17 years. In the episode, it is gradually revealed that the Chin Pokémon toys and games are not just entertainment products. They contain tracking technology. Every Chin Pokémon device carried by a child logs that child's location and transmits the data back to the Japanese corporation responsible for the product. The children walking around their neighborhoods and schools and homes with their Chin Pokémon devices are, without any awareness of it, feeding a continuous stream of real-time location information to a company they know nothing about beyond the fact that it makes something they enjoy very much. The satire is targeting a specific and uncomfortable truth about how entertainment products can function as surveillance systems, and how willingness to participate in that surveillance is directly proportional to how enjoyable the product is. The more a child loves the thing, the more completely they will carry it with them everywhere. And the more completely they carry it everywhere, the more thoroughly the tracking works. In November of 1999, this was a conceptual exaggeration for comedic purposes. Consumer-grade location tracking technology of the kind the episode describes didn't exist in any meaningful form. GPS technology existed, but it was expensive, military-adjacent, and completely alien to the consumer landscape. The smartphone was still 8 years in the future. The idea that a children's entertainment product might routinely harvest and transmit real-time location data was something that sat comfortably in the category of satirical science fiction, or the kind of thing you could put in a cartoon to make a dark comic point without anyone reasonably expecting it to become a description of actual consumer behavior. July 6, 2016, Pokémon Go launched globally. The app had been developed by a company called Niantic, which had been spun off from Google the previous year. It used augmented reality and real-world mapping to place virtual Pokémon creatures within actual physical locations. To play it, you had to physically move through your real environment. Your phone's GPS tracked your location continuously, and the game used that data to determine what creatures were available to you and where you needed to go to find them. It was a brilliant, genuinely innovative design, and the world responded to it on a scale that was extraordinary even by the standards of successful mobile applications. Within days of launch, Pokémon Go was breaking App Store records across multiple countries simultaneously. By the end of its first week, it had been downloaded tens of millions of times. By the end of its first month, the global download count had exceeded 130 million, and the app's daily active user numbers surpassed Twitter's. People were playing it everywhere, in parks, on sidewalks, in shopping malls, in cemeteries, at the edges of military installations, in the middle of traffic. Several people were injured walking into objects or stepping off curbs while playing. Multiple people trespassed on private property because their app indicated a rare Pokémon was available there. Someone drove off a road in Montana following a creature their screen told them was nearby. And throughout all of this, 130 million people had agreed, cheerfully and without much apparent hesitation, to allow a company that had been spun off from Google to track their physical location continuously and in real time. The location tracking was not a bug or an unintended consequence. It was the core mechanism of the product. The game existed because of the tracking, and people loved the game. The Chin Pokemon episode had described this in its satirical form in November of 1999, not as a specific prediction of a specific product, but as an identification of something real about human behavior in relation to entertainment and technology. And the observation was this: if you wrap a surveillance mechanism in something enjoyable enough, people will not only accept it, but actively choose to carry it with them everywhere they go. The episode treated this as dark and alarming in 1999. By 2016, it had become a feature of a beloved game. The episode was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program in the year 2000. Looking at it now, with 17 years of hindsight between the episode and the real-world phenomenon it was describing in advance, the nomination feels like it was recognizing something it didn't fully know it was recognizing. This prediction sits differently from the Trump example for a reason I find worth articulating. The Trump prediction required observing something that was visibly happening in the political landscape, and following its logic forward by about 14 months. The Chin Pokemon prediction required something different, and in some ways more remarkable. It required imagining a technological future that didn't exist yet, identifying one of its central social dynamics correctly, and embedding that identification in a cartoon parody of a card game. Parker and Stone weren't observing Pokemon Go when they wrote Chin Pokemon. They couldn't have been. They were observing Pokemon, and they followed the satirical logic of what they observed to a place that reality took 17 years to reach. There's something genuinely strange about that, and I think it's worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. The next example is a shorter distance in time, but I would argue an equally precise prediction. This one is about a person rather than a technology, and about the distance that can exist between a public image and a private reality, and what it looks like when that distance collapses. March 31st, 2004, Season 8, Episode 4. The episode is called The Passion of the Jew. The immediate context for the episode was the release of Mel Gibson's film, The Passion of the Christ, in February of that year, which had been one of the most discussed and debated movies in recent Hollywood history. The film had been produced independently by Gibson after every major studio passed on it. It had generated enormous controversy even before its release over concerns about its graphic depiction of the crucifixion and the potential for its framing to stoke anti-Semitic sentiment. When it was released, it made approximately $612 million worldwide and became the highest-grossing R-rated film in American history at that point. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary cultural event, and South Park, writing in real time in early 2004, had to respond to it. The Passion of the Jew is a complicated episode that goes in several directions at once, as South Park episodes from this period often do. But the specific element that matters for our purposes tonight is how the episode portrays Mel Gibson himself. In the episode, Gibson is depicted as having lost touch with reality in ways that go beyond ordinary eccentricity. He is shown as clearly anti-Semitic beneath his public persona, and that anti-Semitism is presented not as an inference or a suspicion, but as a straightforward fact about who the character is. He is also shown as erratic, grandiose, and fundamentally unserious about the religious sincerity he was presenting to the world as the motivation for the film. The South Park version of Mel Gibson in this episode is someone whose public image is a performance covering a private reality that is significantly less admirable. The mask in the context of the cartoon is very thin. At the time the episode aired, Mel Gibson was one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood. He was both a major star and a highly regarded director. The Passion of the Christ Whatever controversy it had generated was a financial triumph that demonstrated his ability to create commercial events without the support of the studio system. In March of 2004, defending Mel Gibson publicly was a position that many people in the entertainment industry were willing to take and did take. He was, to most of the world, a complicated figure perhaps, but a legitimate and accomplished one. 2 years and 4 months later, on July 28, 2006, Gibson was stopped by law enforcement on Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu, California. His blood alcohol level was nearly twice the legal limit. During the arrest, he made a series of statements directed at Jewish people that were documented and widely reported in the days that followed. As the content of those statements left nothing ambiguous about the nature of the sentiment they were expressing. He also attempted to escape from the police vehicle during the process of the arrest. The story was reported everywhere. It generated the kind of media coverage that permanently alters a public figure's relationship with their audience and their industry. It confirmed what South Park had depicted in cartoon form in March of 2004, that the anti-Semitism the show had portrayed as being beneath the surface was not satirical invention, but accurate identification. The erratic behavior that the episode had drawn was not exaggeration for comedic purposes, but description of something real. The episode had looked at a man whose public face was one thing and stated, with the confidence that is characteristic of good satire at its most honest, that the private reality was something considerably different. And the private reality had come out on a Malibu highway 2 years and 4 months after the cartoon said it would. I want to be clear about something regarding this particular prediction. The accuracy here is not something to feel straightforwardly celebratory about, because what the prediction anticipated was genuine harm, the exposure of real anti-Semitism in a real person, and the events of that night in Malibu were not entertainment. But the accuracy belongs in this account because the pattern requires us to look at the full range of what South Park has called correctly, not just the amusing items on the list. The show looked at Mel Gibson in the spring of 2004 and identified something real. The world confirmed the identification 2 years later. That's part of the pattern. What's worth noting about this example is the specific nature of the insight involved. Parker and Stone didn't have inside information about Gibson. They had the same publicly available information about him that everyone had. They had his films, his public statements, the coverage of the Passion of the Christ, and whatever general impression he made through the media. What they apparently did in the writing of the episode was follow the implications of that publicly available information more honestly than most of the media coverage at the time was willing to do. They drew a portrait that was, in retrospect, more accurate than the flattering portraits being drawn elsewhere. And they did it in a cartoon about a fart joke show, 2 years before the confirmation arrived. Now let's talk about Jared from Subway. And I want to be clear before we begin that this particular story involves serious criminal behavior toward minors. And while I'm going to handle the subject with appropriate care, the reason it belongs in this video is precisely the fact that the show's prediction of the arc of his public life made in 2002 turned out to be accurate in ways that are impossible to dismiss. In March of 2002, South Park aired an episode called Jared Has AIDS. It is season 6, episode 1. The episode is about Jared Fogle, who is at the time one of the most recognizable advertising faces in America. So Fogle had first appeared in Subway commercials in 1998, built around a story of losing over 200 pounds largely by substituting Subway sandwiches for the fast food he had previously eaten. The marketing campaign had been genuinely effective and had run for years by the time the episode aired. By 2002, Jared Fogle was the kind of famous person that Americans have a very specific cultural relationship with. The person from the commercial, present everywhere, pleasant and relatable, associated with a brand that was part of daily American life. The episode plays on Fogle's name and premise in the ways South Park plays on everything, which is to say irreverently and with zero interest in treating the subject gently. The episode's central joke involves Jared claiming that his weight loss is due to his having AIDS, which everyone immediately assumes means AIDS, causing instant public catastrophe. The show is mocking the corporate machinery of personal story advertising, the way an entire brand had been constructed on a single man's testimonial, and the vulnerability that creates if anything about the man or the story turns out to be other than what the advertising presents. The episode ends with Jared being fired from Subway in disgrace. The real reason isn't the disease confusion, but the revelation that the story behind the advertising is more complicated than it appeared. The show was pointing at a structural truth, that the Subway brand had been built entirely on Jared Fogle, and that this meant an enormous amount was depending on Jared Fogle being exactly what the advertising said he was. 13 years passed. Fogle continued to work for Subway. He appeared in more advertisements. He remained one of the most recognizable brand spokespeople in American food industry history. The association between the man and the chain was, if anything, stronger in 2015 than it had been in 2002. In August of 2015, federal agents searched Fogle's home in Indiana. The investigation that followed made clear that Fogle had been involved in the possession and distribution of child sexual abuse material and had paid for commercial sex acts involving minors. He was arrested and entered a guilty plea. On November 19, 2015, he was sentenced to 15 years and 8 months in federal prison. Subway terminated all association with him the same day his home was searched. The South Park episode aired 13 years before that day. It depicted Jared Fogle being fired from Subway in disgrace following the revelation of something he had been concealing. The specifics are entirely different. The structural prediction that Jared Fogle would eventually be discovered to have been misrepresenting something essential about himself, and that this discovery would end his relationship with Subway in disgrace, turned out to be accurate. The brand built entirely on one person's story ended as that story collapsed. South Park's later inclusion of Fogle as a villain character in the 2017 game South Park: The Fractured But Whole reads, in hindsight, as the acknowledgement that the show had been circling the subject since 2002. It's an uncomfortable acknowledgement in the sense that all of this is uncomfortable, but it's there. These three predictions, the Chipotle surveillance observation from '99, the Mel Gibson portrait from 2004, and the Jared Fogle structural prediction from 2002, share something that I think is worth identifying explicitly before we move on. None of them required any special knowledge unavailable to anyone else. They required honest attention to the logic of what was already present and visible. The technology was already moving in the direction that consumer surveillance would eventually take. The man behind the Passion of the Christ was already visible in ways that the episode captured. The brand architecture of the Subway Jared campaign was already as vulnerable as the episode identified. The show looked at all of these things clearly, without the protective filters of politeness or commercial interest or simple optimism, and put what it saw on screen, and then waited, as it turned out, for the world to catch up. There is a category of South Park prediction that I find particularly interesting, and it's different from the ones we've looked at so far. The Trump prediction and the Mel Gibson prediction and the Jared Fogle prediction all involve South Park identifying something about a person or a political situation and following that identification forward. But there's another kind of prediction in the show's history where the accuracy comes not from analyzing a person or a political trajectory, but from a single throwaway line about a corporation that turns out to describe, years later, a real and genuinely bizarre event that the writers couldn't possibly have been aware of in advance. This next example is one of those, and it is, I think, one of the funniest entries in the entire list, in the particular way that things become funny when they shouldn't be. Season 14, Episode 14. The episode is called Creme Fraiche, and it aired on October 27th, 2010. The episode's main storyline is about Randy Marsh developing an obsession with cooking shows, and it's a perfectly enjoyable South Park episode that holds up well as an example of the show doing what it does with a specific pop cultural phenomenon of its era. But the detail that matters for tonight isn't the main storyline at all. It's a single line, a throwaway line, the kind of thing that flies by in a moment and is immediately forgotten in the rush of the episode's larger comedic concerns. The line comes from a news program playing in the background of a scene. A news anchor delivers a brief report, and in the course of that report, as a minor descriptive detail, the anchor mentions that passengers on the Carnival cruise line have described the experience as smelling like poop. The line gets a quick laugh as part of a longer joke, and the episode moves on. Nobody thought much about it. It was a joke about a cruise line, a brand associated with a certain kind of mass-market leisure that is an easy target for gentle mockery. The show filed it away and moved on. 3 years later, in February of 2013, a Carnival cruise line ship called the Triumph departed from Galveston, Texas, on a 4-day cruise to Mexico. What followed became one of the more extraordinary consumer catastrophe stories in recent American history, and it earned a nickname that you may remember from the news coverage at the time, the Poop Cruise. On February 10th, a fire broke out in the engine room of the Triumph. The fire was contained and nobody was seriously injured, but it disabled the ship's electrical systems and, critically, its plumbing. The Triumph was left adrift in the Gulf of Mexico for 5 days. Approximately 3,100 passengers and more than 1,000 crew members were stranded on a ship without functioning toilets, without air conditioning in the Gulf of Mexico in February, with severely limited food service, and with sewage that had nowhere to go. Reports from passengers described overflowing toilets, bags of human waste being stored in hallways, the smell of sewage permeating the ship, and a general atmosphere of discomfort and distress that no amount of shore excursion credits was going to adequately compensate. The media covered the story extensively and with a degree of dark enthusiasm that was entirely appropriate to the circumstances. The Triumph incident ended Carnival's run as a punchline-free cruise operator. It became the defining story of the cruise industry for an extended period, and it generated serious conversations about safety standards and regulatory oversight in the commercial cruise business. It was also, and this is the part that matters for tonight, almost exactly what a South Park news anchor had described 3 years earlier as a throwaway joke in a background news segment. The line about Carnival smelling like poop became, in 2013, the most accurate thing South Park had ever said about the cruise industry. Not because anyone predicted a specific mechanical failure, not because the show had information about the Triumph's maintenance schedule, but because a writer put a single dismissive line about a corporation into a background news ticker, and 3 years later, reality found a way to make that line seem like advance reporting. There's a particular quality to this kind of prediction that I want to identify because it comes up more than once in the show's history. It's the prediction that comes not from careful analysis, but from casual mockery. The show makes a joke about a company. The joke is at the company's expense. It's not research. It's not investigation. It's not even really a satirical argument. It's just a quick dismissal that happens to land on something real. And then years later, something happens at that company that makes the quick dismissal look like it was paying attention to something. I think what this actually reflects is a kind of accumulated cultural knowledge that comes from years and years of writing satire about the world. When you've spent a decade and a half paying close attention to how corporations behave and to the gap between how companies present themselves publicly and what the experience of their product actually involves, you develop a pattern-matching instinct for which kinds of companies are likely to be associated with which kinds of failures. The Carnival line in Creme Fraiche isn't a prediction so much as a recognition in a single line, and of something that a company like Carnival was, in some sense, always going to produce eventually. And then the Triumph happened, and the recognition turned out to be correct. South Park's writers probably didn't know they were predicting anything, but they put a joke on screen that turned out to describe a real event that occurred 3 years later, with a specificity that makes the word coincidence feel slightly inadequate. From a maritime disaster to Hollywood, and from an event about a corporation to something much more personal. This next prediction is one that I find quietly sad when I think about it fully, because it involves a real person going through something genuinely painful, and the show's prediction of that pain was, in its own way, a kind of early and unwanted understanding of something that was already in motion. Season 12, Episode 2. The episode is called Britney's New Look, and it aired on March 26, 2008. In the winter and spring of 2007 and 2008, Britney Spears was in a very public and very distressing period of her life. She had, in the previous year, shaved her head at a salon in Tarzana, California, in an incident that was captured by photographers and became one of the most widely circulated celebrity photographs of the decade. She had lost custody of her children. She had been involuntarily hospitalized twice under psychiatric evaluation. The coverage of her life during this period was constant, aggressive, and frequently lacking in any apparent empathy for the person at its center. She was, in the vocabulary of celebrity journalism at the time, a mess. And the media industry, broadly speaking, was treating her as a product of its own creation that was now producing the most commercially valuable content it could produce. The Britney episode is, for South Park, an unusually serious piece of work underneath its surface irreverence. The episode doesn't mock Britney Spears. It makes the argument, with considerable force, that the media ecosystem and the public that consumed celebrity coverage were doing something genuinely harmful to a specific human being, and that this harm was being performed with enthusiasm and without remorse by people who had convinced themselves they were just covering a story. The episode follows the boys' exploitation of Britney's situation for their own purposes and ends with Britney being hounded until she collapses. The final sequence of the episode makes explicit what the show was arguing, that the media had been effectively conducting something like a ritual sacrifice of a young woman's sanity for the entertainment of its audience. But the prediction embedded in this episode isn't about Britney at all. It's about the final moments, when the show looks at what comes next. At the end of the episode, after Britney's collapse, a news anchor describes what has happened as a kind of harvest, the completion of a cycle that the entertainment media regularly performs. And the anchor then says, almost as an afterthought, that the next subject for this cycle, the next person the entertainment machine has selected to build up and then tear apart for the benefit of its audience, is Miley Cyrus. When the episode aired in March of 2008, Miley Cyrus was 15 years old. She was the star of Hannah Montana on Disney Channel, one of the most successful children's television programs in the world at that time. And she was, at that age, an almost universally beloved figure in the world of family entertainment. She had not done anything that would have suggested the kind of public controversy that Britney Spears had become synonymous with. She was, from the outside, exactly the kind of stable and wholesome celebrity presence that the Disney brand was designed to cultivate and protect. The line about Miley being next was a darkly comedic throwaway, the show's bleak and somewhat resigned observation that the entertainment machine doesn't stop cycling, it just finds a new subject when the previous one is used up. Most viewers would have registered it as a joke and moved on. Neither the idea of Miley Cyrus becoming the next Britney Spears in terms of tabloid coverage and public meltdown narrative seemed, in March of 2008, like an absurd exaggeration. Within about a year of the episode airing, a series of incidents began attracting attention to Miley Cyrus in ways that were distinct from her Hannah Montana persona. Photographs appeared, magazine covers changed tone, public statements she made began to generate controversy. By 2010, 2011, and into 2012 and 2013, Miley Cyrus's public image was undergoing a transformation that brought with it exactly the kind of intense, often uncharitable media attention that the episode had identified her as the next recipient of. The transformation was deliberate on her part in many respects, a conscious artistic evolution. But the media cycle it triggered, the build-up and pull-apart machinery, the cultivation of controversy, and the commercial exploitation of that controversy was exactly the cycle the South Park episode had described. By 2013, following a widely discussed performance at an industry award show, Miley Cyrus was one of the most polarizing figures in entertainment. The coverage of her was intense, frequently harsh, and commercially self-interested in all the ways the South Park episode had identified as the characteristic features of this specific media pattern. The show had named her in March of 2008 as the next person the machine was coming for. The machine arrived on schedule. What makes the Britney and Miley prediction interesting isn't just the naming of a specific person. It's the identification of a structural pattern in how the entertainment media treats certain kinds of young women. South Park is arguing in this episode that the celebrity machine operates in cycles, that it requires subjects, that subjects are chosen and cultivated and then consumed, and that the choosing of the next subject is predictable because it follows a logic that has nothing to do with the individuals involved and everything to do with the needs of the media apparatus itself. The show identified Miley Cyrus as next in the cycle in 2008, and it was right, not because it had special knowledge of what Miley would do or choose or become, but because it understood the pattern the machine was running and looked at who the machine was currently investing in. That's a more interesting kind of prediction than a lucky guess. It's an observation about how a system works, applied to a specific case, and confirmed by what the system subsequently did. Parker and Stone were right about Miley, not because they know something about Miley, but because they understand something about media machinery that, when applied correctly, tells you where the machinery is pointed. And now from the entertainment industry to Colorado, which is geographically very close to where South Park is set. And from a cultural media observation to what amounts to a policy prediction that came true with an almost embarrassing degree of precision. Season 14, Episode 3. The episode is called Medicinal Fried Chicken, and it aired on March 31st, 2010. The episode's premise is straightforward. Colorado has legalized medical marijuana, and the resulting proliferation of dispensaries has crowded out other businesses in the town, including the local KFC franchise. This bothers Randy Marsh enormously as a devoted fan of fried chicken, and sends him on a quest to find a medical reason to be prescribed marijuana. It is a typically South Park episode, absurd and energetic and full of the kind of specificity that makes even its most ridiculous premises feel grounded. The prediction embedded in this episode is about one of the episode's background details rather than its main plot. The episode presents Colorado as a state in which recreational marijuana use is effectively normalized, in which dispensaries are common and prominent, and in which fried chicken is harder to find than cannabis. In short, the episode presents a version of Colorado in which marijuana has been broadly legalized and integrated into the commercial landscape of everyday life. It presents this not as a speculative future, but as the current state of the fictional town that is broadly a representation of real Colorado. When the episode aired on March 31st, 2010, this was not the reality of Colorado. Medical marijuana had been legal in the state since Amendment 20 was passed in November of 2000, but recreational marijuana was not legal. It was still illegal under state law to purchase, possess, or consume marijuana for purposes other than medical use with a valid prescription. Colorado was not, in 2010, a state that had normalized recreational cannabis. The dispensary landscape the episode depicts, ubiquitous and commercially dominant, was a satirical extrapolation, not a description of existing fact. November 6th, 2012. Colorado voters approved Amendment 64, which removed marijuana from the state's list of controlled substances and allowed for the recreational purchase, possession, and use of cannabis by adults over 21. Colorado became one of the first 2 states in the country to legalize recreational marijuana alongside Washington. The first recreational sales began on January 1st, 2014. The episode aired in March of 2010. The law passed in November of 2012. The gap is approximately 2 years and 8 months. In those 2 years and 8 months, where Colorado moved from the world the episode was satirically exaggerating to the world the episode had presented as already existing. I find it interesting that Parker and Stone, who are based in Los Angeles and set their show in a fictional Colorado, were writing about the legal marijuana future of that state in 2010 before the state's voters decided to create it. The episode doesn't argue for or against legalization. It simply presents a version of Colorado in which it has happened, uses that version as the premise for a story about Randy Marsh's fried chicken crisis, and moves on. But the premise turned out to be prescient. Within a few years of legalization in Colorado, the commercial landscape of major Colorado cities did begin to show the kinds of changes the episode had depicted. Dispensaries became common. Cannabis companies became significant commercial entities in the state. The integration of marijuana retail into the everyday commercial environment of Colorado, something the episode had treated as a satirical exaggeration in 2010, became, by 2015 and 2016, an ordinary feature of the state's economic life. The episode also contains a secondary prediction that is worth mentioning briefly. One of the subplots involves Cartman creating a black market for KFC in a landscape where fried chicken has been displaced by cannabis dispensaries. The black market fried chicken element is played entirely for comedy and is one of the funnier running jokes in the episode. 8 years later, in February of 2018, FC UK found itself embroiled in a chicken supply crisis that temporarily forced the closure of hundreds of its branches across the United Kingdom after a change in delivery contractors left the chain without sufficient chicken to operate. The joke about a world where KFC is unavailable and people resort to black market methods to obtain it ceased briefly to be entirely hypothetical. The KFC UK shortage is a smaller item than the Colorado legalization prediction, and I don't want to overstate its significance. But it's a good example of how the show's predictions sometimes occur in multiple layers within a single episode, with the main satirical premise of one prediction and a subsidiary element of another, both of which eventually find their real-world confirmations at different points in time. Medicinal fried chicken is a good example of a South Park prediction that works through policy rather than through personality. The show didn't predict what a specific person would do. It predicted the direction a specific political and social conversation was moving. Applied that trajectory to a specific geographic location it had a particular attachment to, and turned out to be 2 years and 8 months ahead of the voters of that state in recognizing where that conversation was going to arrive. That's 3 more predictions across 3 different registers: a corporate catastrophe that confirmed a single throwaway line, a media cycle that named its next subject in advance, and a state-level policy outcome that the show depicted as already existing before the voters decided to make it so. And we're not close to done. And the examples we're going to look at next stretch back further in time and involve predictions where the gap between the episode and the real-world confirmation is measured not in months or years, but in decades. Some of the most interesting predictions in South Park's history are the ones where the gap between the episode and the real-world confirmation isn't months, but years, sometimes many years. And there's something particular about that kind of prediction, a kind of slow burn, where you can look at an episode that aired 15 or 20 years ago and realize only now that it was describing something that has only recently, or only in the last few years, become fully visible in the world. These long-range predictions require a different kind of patience to appreciate, a willingness to look backward across a significant stretch of time and ask what was already being said in rooms and on screens that most of us weren't fully paying attention to. The next example is one of those, and it's also one of the most conceptually rich predictions in the show's history, because it isn't about a single event or a single person. It's about a recurring structural argument in American culture that South Park addressed at a specific moment and correctly identified as something that was going to keep developing in a very specific direction over the following 2 decades. July 5th, 2000, Season 4, Episode 7. The episode is called Chef Goes Nanners, and it involves the town of South Park becoming embroiled in a debate about whether to change the town's flag. The flag in question depicts 4 white stick figures standing around a black stick figure that is being hanged. The debate in the episode is framed around the question of whether this imagery is racist or whether it is simply a historical emblem of the community that should be preserved for reasons of heritage and tradition. Chef, who is black, argues clearly and forcefully that the flag is racist and must be changed. Other townspeople, represented most prominently by Jimbo, argue that the flag is a historical artifact that deserves to be maintained and that changing it would represent an erasure of community identity. The episode is, in its satirical way, engaged with a conversation that was real in the year 2000. The Confederate flag debate in the American South had been ongoing for years by that point, and focused primarily on whether the Confederate battle flag should continue to be incorporated into state flags and displayed on official government property. South Carolina had been the center of sustained national controversy about its display of the Confederate flag on the State House grounds, and the debate was active, contentious, and deeply unresolved when Chef Goes Nanners aired in July of 2000. So the episode was responding to a real and live conversation. But the response was also, in retrospect, ahead of where the public conversation was going to go. In June of 2015, 15 years after the episode aired, a gunman carried out a mass shooting at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. 9 people were killed. The shooter had expressed white supremacist ideology, and photographs emerged showing him with Confederate flags in the days after the attack. The incident generated a national conversation about the Confederate flag's continued presence on official government property and in retail environments that was substantially larger and more consequential than any such conversation had been in the previous decades. What followed over the next several months was exactly the kind of outcome the Chef Goes Nanners debate had been staging in 2000. Major retailers, including Walmart, Amazon, Sears, and eBay, announced that they would stop selling Confederate flag merchandise. South Carolina voted to remove the Confederate flag from the State House grounds. Mississippi, the only remaining state whose official flag still incorporated the Confederate battle emblem at that time, faced renewed pressure to change its flag, which it eventually did in 2020. The conversation about symbols, heritage, historical representation, and their implications for communities moved from the background of public discourse to the foreground in ways that had been building for years, but crystallized dramatically in 2015. South Park's episode had staged this debate in 2000 and presented both sides with the kind of specificity that good satire requires. It had showed the community argument was something approaching genuine fairness, giving both Chef and Jimbo coherent positions rather than simply dismissing one side. And it had ultimately arrived at a resolution that suggested the argument for changing historically harmful symbols was the more defensible one. 15 years after the episode aired, here the real-world version of this same argument arrived at broadly the same place. But the sports team element of this prediction is in some ways even more precise, and it extended the reach of the episode's observation into territory that was less obvious in 2000. The pressure to change names and mascots considered offensive or demeaning to Native American communities was not new in 2000. It had been the subject of advocacy and occasional controversy for years. But in the years following 2015, as the broader cultural conversation about representation and historical symbols intensified, the sports team naming debate moved onto a significantly larger stage. The specific cases that attracted the most attention were the Cleveland Indians of Major League Baseball and the Washington Redskins of the National Football League, two of the highest-profile sports franchises in the country. On December 15, 2020, the Cleveland Indians announced that the team would be changing its name, ending a brand identity that had been in place since 1915. The team's new name, the Cleveland Guardians, was announced in July of 2021 and went into effect for the 2022 season. On July 13, 2020, the Washington Redskins announced they would be retiring their name and logo pending a review. The team played as the Washington football team for the 2020 and 2021 seasons while a permanent name was selected, and in February of 2022, they officially became the Washington Commanders. The Chef Goes Nanners episode aired on July 5, 2000. It staged a community argument about whether to change a symbol considered racially offensive, with the argument for change ultimately prevailing. The same argument, applied to sports team names and carried out on a national stage, reached the same conclusion between 2020 and 2022. 20 years is a long gap between a satirical premise and its real-world resolution. But the structural argument the episode was making in 2000 turned out to be the structural argument that major American sports franchises were having 2 decades later. What makes South Park's engagement with this particular topic interesting is the longevity of the prediction. The show wasn't describing a trend that was about to happen. It was describing an argument that was going to keep developing, keep intensifying, and eventually produce consequences that the show correctly identified as the likely direction of the argument's resolution. Not in 5 years, in 20 years. And then it happened. Let's shift from a long-range prediction to a short one, because the next example is one where the gap between the episode and the real-world event it anticipates is measured in months rather than years. And the precision is so tight that it's worth spending time with the specific dates. Season 14, Episode 9, October 13th, 2010. The episode is called It's a Jersey Thing, and it is primarily a parody of Jersey Shore. Yet the MTV reality television program that had premiered in December of 2009 and immediately become one of the most watched and most discussed television series in the country. Jersey Shore was a genuine cultural phenomenon in 2010, and South Park, true to its production philosophy, wanted to respond to it in real time. The episode's central premise involves South Park being overrun by people from New Jersey, all of them behaving in ways inspired by the Jersey Shore cast, and the town's increasingly desperate attempts to deal with the situation. The plot escalates, as South Park plots typically do, to the point of complete absurdity, and eventually involves one of the characters sending a videotape to Osama bin Laden asking for help. Osama bin Laden in the episode's logic comes through, and in the final sequence of the main plot, bin Laden is honored for his assistance when a Special Forces commando drops from the ceiling and shoots him in the head. This was not the first time South Park had depicted bin Laden's death. The show had developed something of a running joke involving him throughout the years following September 11th, 2001, with bin Laden dying in various episodes and then reappearing as though nothing had happened, following the same basic logic as Kenny's recurring deaths. By the time of the Jersey Thing episode in 2010, the joke had been running for nearly 9 years. The episode aired on October 13th, 2010. Osama bin Laden was killed by United States Navy SEALs in Abbottabad, Pakistan on May 2, 2011. The gap between the episode and the actual event is approximately 6 months and 19 days. The parallel between the fictional event and the real one is more specific than just the fact of bin Laden's death. In the episode, the killing is performed by a military commando who approaches from above, and the nature of the kill is a gunshot to the head. The real operation in Abbottabad was carried out by Naval Special Warfare Development Group operators, many of them arriving by helicopter, and bin Laden was killed by gunshot wounds. The South Park version of the killing is absurdist and comedic, but its broad structural description of a Special Forces commando using a gun to kill Osama bin Laden is not an imprecise description of what actually happened in 2011. It's worth being clear about what kind of prediction this is. Nobody is suggesting that Parker and Stone had intelligence about what the American military was planning. The running joke about bin Laden dying at the hands of American military action had been running for 9 years. It was always going to be the eventual punchline of that joke, in the same way that a show about a character who keeps almost getting arrested is always building toward an eventual arrest. The prediction isn't about special knowledge, it's about following a 9-year running gag to its logical conclusion and happening to land it 6 months before the conclusion became real. But the timing is genuinely striking, and the specificity of the detail, a military commando, overhead approach, gunshot to the head, is close enough to the actual events that the episode sits in an interesting place when you look at it with what we now know. The show retired the running gag. Real events retired the subject of the running gag 6 months later. And the ending they wrote for the gag in October 2010 turned out to rhyme in its essential structure with the way the real thing ended in May 2011. That's the bin Laden prediction. Brief in time, specific in detail, and probably the sharpest example of a long-running satirical joke arriving at its natural conclusion just before reality decided to provide the same conclusion. Now let's go somewhere completely different. March 17th, 2004, Season 8, Episode 5. The episode is called Awesome O, and it is one of the most beloved episodes in South Park's history. The premise is that Cartman, pursuing an elaborate scheme to humiliate Butters, disguises himself as a robot named Awesome O 4000. Butters, being Butters, is completely taken in and treats the robot as a genuine friend and confidant. The episode is primarily a story about the relationship between Cartman and Butters, told through the conceit of the robot costume, and it is genuinely funny and genuinely touching in the way that the best South Park episodes manage to be both things at once. But nested inside the episode's main comedic premise is a subplot that, if you were watching it in 2004, was entirely a background joke, but which looks considerably different in 2020 and 2023 and 2024. In the subplot, a Hollywood film executive discovers what he believes to be a powerful artificial intelligence machine in the form of Awesome-O. And the executive immediately recognizes the commercial possibilities of using this machine to generate movie ideas. The joke is that Awesome-O, which is actually just Cartman in a cardboard box, produces an enormous volume of Adam Sandler vehicle concepts with extraordinary speed. And the studio executive responds with delight at having an AI system that can, at great volume and at no creative cost, generate formulaic, commercially viable film concepts. The joke in 2004 is about Hollywood's relationship with formulas, about the factory production quality of certain kinds of studio output, about the way the commercial logic of the film industry reduces creative decision-making to a kind of algorithm. Cartman as AI is the satirical mechanism for this observation. The joke works because the idea that a cardboard box robot could replace Hollywood creative thinking is absurd, but the idea that Hollywood creative thinking already has a mechanical quality is something the audience in 2004 is willing to accept as a satirical point. Now, in 2020, Warner Brothers announced an investment in an artificial intelligence system called Synalytic, designed to analyze film data and assist with the assessment of projects' commercial potential. The studio announced that the system would be used to evaluate casting decisions, release strategies, and to provide analytical support for the studio's development and production decision-making processes. The system was designed to reduce uncertainty in the production pipeline by replacing human intuition with data-driven analysis. Studios investing in AI tools for business decision-making and entertainment became an increasingly visible trend in the years that followed. In May of 2023, the Writers Guild of America went on strike, and one of the central issues was the use of artificial intelligence in the production of television and film content. The studios have been exploring the use of AI tools to generate scripts, outlines, and story treatments that human writers would then revise, which would have the practical effect of reducing the amount of work for which writers needed to be compensated. The strike lasted 148 days and ended in late September of 2023. The Screen Actors Guild went on strike the same summer over related concerns, including the use of AI-generated digital likenesses of actors without adequate compensation. It was the first simultaneous strike by both major Hollywood guilds in 63 years, and artificial intelligence was at the center of both disputes. Awesome-O, the cardboard robot Cartman built in 2004 to prank Butters, generated Adam Sandler concepts at great speed for a delighted studio executive who saw no reason to involve human creative thought when a machine could do the job. The episode was played entirely for laughs. The absurdity was in the premise, the idea that Hollywood would use an actual robot to make creative decisions. By 2020 and 2023, the absurdity had migrated. It wasn't an actual robot, but it was a system, and the studios were genuinely trying to use it in ways that the writers and actors and creative professionals of Hollywood found sufficiently threatening to walk off the job for the better part of a year. The Awesome-O episode is a prediction that works on two levels. The obvious one is the AI in Hollywood element, which is easy to see in retrospect. But the more interesting one is the show's identification in 2004 of the specific commercial logic that would eventually drive real studios toward real AI tools. The joke in the episode isn't that AI is evil, and it's that Hollywood's commercial incentive structure is so thoroughly oriented toward formula and risk reduction that the idea of replacing human creativity with a machine is, from the studio's perspective, entirely rational. And that observation turned out to be accurate enough that the real studio spent 20 years gradually moving in the direction the episode described, and then arrived somewhere close enough to the joke's premise that real people walked off real jobs over it. 3 predictions across 3 very different subjects. A 15-year cultural argument about symbols and representation that arrived at the conclusion the show staged in 2000. A 6-month military timeline that rhymed precisely with the structure of a 9-year running gag, and a 20-year drift toward AI-assisted creative decision-making in Hollywood that turned a cardboard robot joke into something uncomfortably close to an industry memo. These are not the same kind of prediction. They don't work the same way, but they are all part of the same pattern, and the pattern keeps showing up in different forms across the full length of this show's extraordinary run. We're going to slow things down a little here because the next prediction on the list is one that arrived in 2 separate waves at 2 different points in time, and each wave confirmed a different part of the same original observation. It's a good example of how South Park's satirical instincts sometimes turn out to be right about more than one thing at once, and of how the passage of time can keep adding confirmations to episodes that seem to have already said their piece. Season 18, Episode 2, October 8th, 2014. The episode is called The Magic Bush. The central premise of the episode involves the townspeople of South Park discovering that their neighbor, Craig Tucker's father, has been flying a drone equipped with a camera over people's homes and yards, recording them without their consent. When the town discovers the surveillance drone, they don't respond by simply demanding he stop. Instead, one by one, they all acquire their own drones and begin flying them over each other's properties, conducting counter-surveillance, surveillance in retaliation for surveillance, and surveillance for its own sake. The situation escalates rapidly, as South Park situations always do, from a neighborly dispute into something that involves police drones, military drones, and eventually a full-scale drone battle over the residential neighborhoods of the town. The episode was written in the autumn of 2014, a moment when drones were transitioning from an expensive specialist technology into something that was beginning to appear in the consumer market at accessible price points. The consumer drone market was growing, but it was still early. Most people didn't own one. The specific cultural anxieties about privacy, surveillance, airspace, and the complex new social dynamics that come from everyone potentially having access to aerial cameras were just beginning to develop into something that the broader public was engaged with. South Park was, as usual, picking up on something in the early stages of its cultural development and pushing it to its logical extreme. The first confirmation of the episode's prediction came relatively quickly. At the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea, officials found themselves dealing with a genuine operational problem involving civilian drones entering restricted airspace over Olympic venues. The solution South Korea deployed was exactly the kind of drone-on-drone response the Magic Bush episode had staged as a satirical exaggeration 4 years earlier. Authorized security drones were used to intercept and ground unauthorized civilian drones that were violating the airspace restrictions. The drone warfare element of the episode, the use of official drones to counter civilian drones, and which had been the episode's most obviously absurdist escalation, had become operational policy at a major international sporting event. The second confirmation came in 2021. The United States announced a federal investment of $37 million in a program designed to equip law enforcement and security agencies with drones specifically intended to identify and neutralize unauthorized civilian drones that entered restricted or sensitive airspace over airports and other secure facilities. The program was explicitly about using drones to police other drones. The episode's satirical conclusion, the entire town's airspace becoming a theater of competing drone operations with official and civilian drones contesting the same space, had moved in less than 7 years, from cartoon absurdism to a line item in a federal security budget. What the Magic Bush episode was really engaging with, underneath the drone warfare escalation, was something broader and more durable than a specific technology. It was engaging with the psychology of surveillance. The episode's underlying argument, stated with South Park's characteristic indirectness, is that access to surveillance technology doesn't produce restraint. It produces more surveillance. When one person gets a surveillance tool, their neighbors don't respond by demanding the tool be put away. They respond by getting their own tools. And the result of everyone having surveillance tools is not a surveillance-free environment, but a surveillance-saturated one, where the tools have proliferated so thoroughly that the original grievance about privacy has been long since submerged beneath the practical reality of universal monitoring. This observation turned out to be accurate about drones specifically, but it also turned out to be accurate about the broader landscape of surveillance technology that developed through the late 2010s and into the 20s. Security cameras in residential settings multiplied. Ring doorbell cameras became standard features of suburban homes. Platforms like Citizen and Neighbors created community surveillance networks built on the contributions of individual users. The psychology the episode was satirizing in 2014, the competitive, mutually escalating proliferation of surveillance tools at the individual and community level, turned out to describe a general social dynamic that extended well beyond drones. The drones were the satirical vehicle. The observation was about something larger. Parker and Stone have a particular gift for this kind of dual-level prediction, where the surface satirical premise turns out to be accurate about a specific technology or event, and the deeper satirical argument turns out to be accurate about a broader social trend. The Magic Bush does this with considerable efficiency. It's a funny episode about drones that also turns out to be a correct observation about surveillance technology and human behavior in relation to it. Both levels of the prediction confirm themselves within 7 years of the episode's broadcast. The drone section of tonight's account is also interesting for what it reveals about the speed at which South Park's real-time production model sometimes operates in relation to prediction. The episode aired in October 2014. The first confirmation arrived in February 2018. The second in 2021, 4 years and 7 years respectively. In the show's history of predictions, these are not unusually short gaps. They are simply typical of the pace at which the cultural and technological directions the show identified moved from sketch to reality. South Park writes something in a week. The world takes a few years to catch up. And when it does, the episode is still there, having said its piece in October 2014, and waited patiently for the world to arrive at the same place. Now to a prediction that is, in its way, one of the most comedically perfect entries on this entire list, because the real-world event it anticipated is so specifically and absurdly close to the original joke that the word coincidence becomes genuinely difficult to sustain. Season 13, Episode 10, October 7th, 2009. The episode is called Dead Celebrities, and it is primarily about Ake Broflovsky being haunted by the ghosts of various celebrities who died in 2009, a year that saw an unusual concentration of prominent deaths in a short period of time. The main plot is a ghost story parody, and it works well on those terms. But the element that matters for tonight is a subplot that doesn't connect to the ghost story at all. It's a commercial parody. In the subplot, the episode features a fictional product advertisement for something called Chipotle. The product is presented as a cleaning solution specifically designed to remove the bloodstains that the advertisement implies people regularly find in their clothing and underwear after eating food from the Chipotle Mexican Grill restaurant chain. The joke is about Chipotle's food causing gastrointestinal distress, which is the kind of mildly rude observation that South Park makes about food chains and consumer culture on a fairly regular basis. It's played entirely for laughs. There is no suggestion in the episode that the joke is anything other than gentle mockery of a popular fast casual restaurant chain. The Chipotle commercial is a background joke in an episode about something else entirely. And when it aired in October of 2009, nobody was particularly alarmed by it or particularly interested in it beyond the immediate laugh it generated. 6 years later, in the autumn of 2015, Chipotle Mexican Grill became the subject of one of the most significant food safety crises in the history of American fast casual dining. Beginning in October of 2015 and extending through the end of the year and into early 2016, a series of foodborne illness outbreaks linked to Chipotle restaurants emerged across multiple American states. The outbreaks involved several different pathogens, and E. coli outbreaks sickened more than 50 people in 14 states between October and December of 2015, and led to the closure of 43 Chipotle restaurants in Oregon and Washington while the source was investigated. A separate norovirus outbreak in Boston sickened approximately 140 people who had eaten at a single location in late October of 2015. A Salmonella outbreak in Minnesota earlier in the same year had already sickened 64 people. The compounding effect of multiple outbreaks at the same chain in the same calendar year was severe. Chipotle's stock price declined dramatically. The company's sales fell sharply. Its carefully constructed identity as the healthy, fresh, ethically sourced alternative to traditional fast food took significant damage. Because the foodborne illness narrative directly contradicted the brand premise that freshness and quality were what distinguished Chipotle from its competitors. The company launched an extensive food safety overhaul, brought in new executives, changed its supply chain practices, and spent years working to rebuild the consumer trust the outbreaks had eroded. The South Park Chipotle commercial aired in October of 2009. It ascribed, in the form of a joke advertisement for a fictional cleaning product, the concept of Chipotle food causing severe enough gastrointestinal consequences to stain people's clothing. 6 years later, Chipotle's food was making people genuinely ill on a scale that required federal investigation, multi-state restaurant closures, and a comprehensive operational overhaul of one of America's most prominent restaurant chains. The Chipotle prediction is not a sophisticated political or cultural analysis. It is not a deep observation about technology or society. It is a simple, crude joke about a restaurant chain causing gastrointestinal problems, which turned out to accurately describe what that restaurant chain would be famous for 6 years later. It's perhaps the most straightforwardly literal prediction in the show's history. The joke was about a thing. The thing happened. Not symbolically or structurally, not as a pattern or a trajectory, but directly. Someone at South Park made a joke about Chipotle making people sick, and 6 years later, Chipotle made a lot of people sick. I mentioned the Chipotle prediction after the more sophisticated entries on this list, partly for the variety, and partly because I think it illustrates something important about the nature of South Park's predictive track record overall. Not all of the show's accurate predictions are the result of sophisticated cultural analysis. Some of them are just jokes that happen to land on real outcomes. Some of them are the product of careful observation. Some of them are the result of following a satirical argument to its logical conclusion. Some of them are just a writer in a room making a rude comment about a corporation, and the corporation subsequently confirming the comment. The range is part of what makes the pattern interesting to look at as a whole rather than as individual, isolated events. And there is one more item I want to sit with before we leave the list entirely, one that involves a pattern of media behavior rather than a specific event, and one the show identified almost 2 decades before the pattern reached full cultural saturation. Season 3, Episode 6, July 7th, 1999. The episode is called Sexual Harassment Panda, and its premise is that South Park Elementary is visited by a character called Petey, the sexual harassment panda, who comes to teach the children about appropriate behavior. This triggers a chain of events where the children become obsessed with filing sexual harassment complaints, generating a wave of litigation that eventually drains the entire town of its financial resources. The episode is primarily a commentary on what the show perceived as a growing culture of litigation in America, and on the specific way that education about sensitive subjects can sometimes produce its own unintended consequences. In 1999, this was a fairly narrow satirical point about the American legal system and corporate liability culture. It was a funny episode, and it was recognized as such, but it was not widely read as a prediction. It was a commentary on something that was already happening to a modest degree in workplaces and schools. An observation about a cultural tendency rather than a forecast of something that was about to grow significantly. The Me Too movement emerged publicly in October of 2017, when a series of investigative reports about Harvey Weinstein's conduct toward women in the film industry, published by the New York Times and the New Yorker, catalyzed a global conversation about sexual harassment and assault that spread rapidly through social media, through entertainment, through media, through politics, and eventually through virtually every professional sector. The movement generated an enormous number of public allegations, firings, resignations, and legal proceedings. It produced significant and ongoing conversations about the nature of appropriate workplace behavior, the structural conditions that enable harassment, and the institutional failures that allow it to persist. The Sexual Harassment Panda episode was not predicting Me Too in the sense of anticipating the specific events of 2017. It was not describing the Harvey Weinstein case or any specific real-world episode of misconduct. What it was doing was identifying, with its usual satirical exaggeration, a dynamic that was latent in the culture in 1999, and that eventually, in a very different form and for very different reasons, became one of the defining social conversations of 2017 and the years that followed. The show saw something in the early culture of sexual harassment, awareness, and education, something about its potential to generate both genuine accountability and also genuine complexity, and it made a satirical argument about that something in 1999. The argument was about a different scale and a different context, but the underlying observation about the way awareness, accountability, and cultural momentum interact was not entirely wrong. I want to be careful here because the Me Too movement addressed real harms that real people experienced, and I don't want the framing of this as a South Park prediction to suggest anything dismissive about the significance or legitimacy of what the movement represented. The sexual harassment panda episode is on this list not because it was right to mock the idea of accountability for harassment, but because the specific cultural dynamic it was observing in 1999, the relationship between formal education about behavior, the culture of reporting and accountability, and the broader social conversations that follow, turned out to be something that, in a completely different form and with entirely different stakes, and became central to the cultural landscape of 2017. The prediction is about a structural dynamic, not about any specific events or people. These additional entries round out the picture in an important way. The predictions in South Park's history aren't limited to a few famous examples. They form a pattern that stretches from the second season to the 23rd and beyond, across virtually every kind of subject matter the show is engaged with. Each one is different. Each one works through different mechanisms and on different timelines. But taken together, they add up to something genuinely unusual in the history of American television. And now I think it's time to try to say what that thing actually is. There is a question underneath everything we've talked about tonight that I've been working toward for the better part of this video, and I want to try to answer it as honestly as I can as we come to the end. The question is simple. Why does this keep happening? The obvious answer is the one I started with, which is that Parker and Stone are extraordinarily attentive to the world around them, that the show's 6-day production cycle forces a kind of relentless engagement with the present that most other creative processes don't require, and that sustained, honest observation of the present will sometimes produce accurate anticipations of the future. That's true, and it matters, and I've tried to build a case for it across everything we've looked at tonight. But I don't think it's the complete answer, and the incomplete parts of the answer are where I want to spend the time we have left. Here is what I've come to think after sitting with all of these examples. South Park's predictive accuracy has less to do with the show seeing things that other people don't see, and more to do with the show saying things that other people don't say. The information that underlies most of these predictions was not hidden. It was available. The cultural momentum that led to Colorado legalizing marijuana was visible in 2010 to anyone paying attention to the trajectory of public opinion polling and ballot initiative history. The signs of Mel Gibson's private self were visible in the public record to anyone willing to look at them without the protective filter of admiration for his work. The direction that the entertainment media's relationship with young female celebrities was likely to take in the years after Britney Spears was visible to anyone who understood the commercial logic of the celebrity attention economy. The information was there. South Park said it out loud. Most other voices didn't, for a variety of reasons: politeness, commercial interest, optimism, the natural human tendency to give the benefit of the doubt, the professional disincentive to say things that might alienate audiences or advertisers or subjects. South Park doesn't have most of those filters, or it has them in much weaker forms than most media. The show will say in public, on television, what it actually thinks, and it will say it in a form, the cartoon, the absurdist premise, the comedic exaggeration, and that gives it a degree of deniability that a newspaper editorial or a direct critical statement wouldn't have. And so it says things that turn out to be true in ways that more constrained forms of commentary couldn't quite manage. There's also something worth naming about the specific virtue of satire as a predictive tool. Satire works by taking the logic of a situation and following it to its honest conclusion. It strips away the optimistic framing, the public relations layer, the social politeness that normally softens how we describe where things are going. What's left once you've stripped all that away is often something that turns out to be a fairly accurate description of where things actually go. Not because the satirist is smarter than everyone else, because the satirist is applying a different filter, to one that doesn't add optimism or tact or institutional loyalty to the raw material of the observation. This is, I think, why the Trump prediction and the Mel Gibson portrait and the Jared Fogle observation and the Pokemon surveillance joke all feel, in retrospect, like they were describing something that was already there, already visible if you were looking without the usual protective layers in place. They weren't predictions in the sense of seeing into the future. They were accurate descriptions of the present, stated in a form that didn't require the usual softening. And the present, when you describe it honestly and without softening, tends to produce futures that look a lot like what you described. There's something quietly encouraging in this, I think, when you sit with it long enough on a quiet night. It's not encouraging in the alarming, conspiratorial way, the way of suggesting that the world is controlled by hidden forces that only cartoonists can see. It's encouraging in a different way. It suggests that the world, for all its noise and chaos and apparent randomness, has a legible shape. That things tend to go in the directions they are already moving, that systems tend to produce the outcomes their logic implies, and that honest attention to the world around you is a form of knowledge that is both accessible and valuable. You don't need to be an oracle to see things coming. You need to be paying attention without pretending that the things you notice are different from what they actually are. South Park has been paying that kind of attention week by week for almost 30 years. 338 episodes. The 28 seasons, a production cycle that forces engagement with the present in ways that no other show in television history has attempted to sustain over anything like a comparable period. And the result of all that sustained, honest, satirically filtered attention to the world is a body of work that, when you go back through it, contains more accurate descriptions of the future than probably any other single creative voice in American entertainment. That is, by any measure, a strange and genuinely impressive thing. And it is the kind of thing that is good to think about on a quiet night when the lights are low and the world outside feels complicated and uncertain. Because the complexity and the uncertainty were always there. And the shape of things, if you look at it honestly enough, is not entirely illegible. The trajectory of events leaves marks before it arrives. The direction of things is visible in the present if you have the patience and the clarity of attention to see it. Parker and Stone have had that patience and that clarity for a very long time. South Park, with all its absurdity and its noise and its complete refusal to be polite about anything, has been one of the most carefully observant voices in American culture for nearly 3 decades. And the predictions we've talked about tonight are what that kind of observation looks like when it's been sustained long enough to be checked against what actually happened. That's a good thing to carry into sleep, I think. The idea that paying attention carefully, looking without flinching, following the honest logic of what you observe is worth something. That clarity is its own kind of comfort, even when what it shows you isn't entirely comfortable. That the world has a shape and the shape can be known, and knowing it is better than not knowing it. So, there you have it. Nearly 3 decades of South Park, 17 years of Pokemon before Pokemon Go, 6 months between a running gag and a real military operation, 2 years and 4 months between a cartoon portrait and a Malibu arrest. 14 months between a fictional Canadian election and a real American one. A 20-year slow burn from a community flag debate to the renaming of 2 major sports franchises. A 3-year gap between a throwaway newsline and the poop cruise. 1 year between a named celebrity and the cultural machine arriving to collect her. 2 years between a Colorado satire and the voters of Colorado. 1999 to 2016 for a Pokemon that watched you. 1998 to 2005 for gay cowboys eating pudding. 2004 to 2023 for a cardboard robot writing Hollywood scripts, each one different, each one its own thing. But all of them part of the same pattern, the same long record of clear-eyed observation expressed in the form of a cartoon about 4 children in a snowy mountain town, and confirmed by the world's slow, reliable tendency to go where it was already going. And there are still a few more items worth adding to that list before tonight is done, because they each bring something different to the picture. The first involves a prediction so specifically timed with such a precise window between the episode and the real-world event, and that it's worth spending some time with just for the sheer coincidence of its calendar. Season 21, Episode 3. The episode is called Holiday Special, and it aired on September 27th, 2017. The episode's main plot follows Randy Marsh, who has been a vocal and public advocate for the cancellation of Columbus Day as a holiday, campaigning to have the town acknowledge the historical harms associated with Christopher Columbus and remove his statues from public spaces. In the course of the episode, it is discovered that Randy has a complicated and hypocritical relationship with the subject. He has been photographed multiple times over the years, dressed as Christopher Columbus at various parties and events. The episode is a sharp and very direct satire of the phenomenon of vocal public advocates for historical reckoning, who are subsequently revealed to have their own uncomfortable history with the very symbols and figures they are demanding others disavow. The episode aired on September 27th, 2017. 2 days later, on September 29th, a news story broke about a librarian in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who had publicly rejected a gift of Dr. Seuss books offered by Melania Trump, citing concerns that certain Seuss illustrations promoted racial stereotypes. The story attracted significant media attention, and coverage of it quickly surfaced photographs showing the same librarian dressed as and promoting the Cat in the Hat, a Dr. Seuss character at a reading event. The pattern the episode had satirized, of a public vocal objection to a symbol combined with a personal history of participation in the same symbol, played out in almost exactly the form the episode had described, within 48 hours of the episode airing. This is probably the most precisely timed prediction in the entire list. Not 14 months, not 6 months, not 2 years. 48 hours from the episode's broadcast to a news story that confirmed its satirical premise with a specificity that made several entertainment journalists do double takes when they connected the timing. But the Columbus episode contains a second prediction that operated on a much longer timeline and involved something significantly more consequential. The episode's premise requires statues of Christopher Columbus to be controversial enough that a town would be debating their removal. In 2017, this was a live debate at a relatively modest scale. The prior year had seen the removal of Confederate statues become a more active public issue, and the Columbus statue question was adjacent to those conversations, but hadn't yet reached the kind of national prominence that would make it feel like an obvious subject for a primetime satire episode. Parker and Stone put it on screen anyway, as part of a season that was clearly engaged with the broader conversation about historical representation and public symbols. In the spring and summer of 2020, following the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May and the nationwide and international protests that followed, the removal of statues representing figures associated with slavery, colonialism, and racial violence became one of the most active and visible public debates in American history. Statues of Confederate generals, slave traders, and colonial figures were removed or toppled in cities across the United States, the United Kingdom, and other countries. Columbus statues specifically became a focus of the controversy in multiple American cities. The statue of Columbus in Richmond, Virginia was thrown into a lake. The statue in Boston's North End was removed by the city following protests. Statues in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Sacramento, California were pulled down or removed. The national conversation about Columbus statues in 2020 was substantially larger, more intense, and more politically consequential than anything that had been happening in the conversation when Holiday Special aired in September of 2017. The episode had staged the Columbus statue debate as a satirical premise in 2017. The real-world equivalent of that debate arrived in its most intense form 3 years later and was significantly more serious, more consequential, and more nationally visible than the episode's premise required it to be. The show had identified the direction of a cultural argument before it reached its most prominent moment. This is, again, not a prediction in the mystical sense. The cultural momentum toward this conversation was already building in 2017. Parker and Stone followed it forward to a place it took the broader culture a few more years to reach. The holiday special episode is a good example of a prediction that works on two completely different timelines simultaneously. The specific satirical premise, the 2 days later hypocrisy revelation, confirmed itself almost immediately. The broader cultural argument the episode was staged around confirmed itself 3 years later in a much more prominent and consequential form. Two predictions from one episode at vastly different scales and timings. This is not unusual for South Park. Many of the examples we've looked at tonight have this quality of operating at multiple levels, with different confirmations arriving at different distances from the original broadcast. The final item in this account involves something that I find quietly funny in a way that I think is appropriate for a show that has spent nearly 3 decades being funny about things that turn out to be more real than they seemed. Season 18, Episode 6, November 19th, 2014. The episode is called Freemium Isn't Free, and it is about the boys becoming addicted to freemium mobile games, the kind that are free to download but generate revenue through in-app purchases of virtual currency, power-ups, cosmetic items, and progress accelerators. The episode is a pointed and well-observed satire of the freemium business model, arguing that the games are designed with the specific intention of exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, that the dopamine response they trigger is functionally similar to the response triggered by gambling, and that the business model is built on the extraction of money from a small percentage of users who become sufficiently compelled by the mechanics to spend significantly. The episode names this explicitly and without much interest in being polite about it. The episode is sharp and intelligent and holds up well as a piece of satire about the mobile gaming economy in 2014. It's also the episode that makes what I consider to be the most ironically self-aware prediction in the show's history, because the prediction involves South Park itself. 3 years after Freemium Isn't Free aired, in 2017, a mobile game called South Park Phone Destroyer was released by Ubisoft. The Phone Destroyer is a mobile strategy card game set in the South Park universe, featuring characters, dialogue, and visual design from the show. The game is free to download. It generates revenue through in-app purchases of virtual currency, power-ups, card packs, and cosmetic items. Its business model is, in the structural sense, exactly the freemium model that the 2014 episode was criticizing. The game named South Park, built using the South Park characters and the South Park aesthetic, does a specific thing the South Park episode said was a psychologically exploitative business model. I don't know whether this is an irony that Parker and Stone intended, or one they noticed and ignored for commercial reasons, or one that happened without their full awareness. But it is real. South Park made a pointed, yet fairly sharp critique of freemium game mechanics in November 2014. South Park released a freemium game in 2017. The prediction, in this case, was about what South Park itself would do. The show that predicted the Trump presidency, the Pokemon Go surveillance economy, the Carnival Poop cruise, and the pattern of media treating young female celebrities as commercial products, also predicted its own future product line. Somewhat, in a way that is either deeply ironic or entirely fitting, depending on how you feel about corporations and their relationships with their own critical output. I include it at the end of tonight because it seems like the right note to end on, in a story that is fundamentally about a show that looks carefully at the world around it, and then discovers with some frequency, that the world has been looking back. And that really is the last thing I want to say about all of this before we go. If you've been listening tonight with the kind of half-awake, comfortable attention that late hours encourage, you may have noticed that the thread running through all of these predictions is not, when you look at it carefully, some mysterious gift for seeing what others can't see. It's something more democratic than that. It's the result of showing up consistently with genuine clarity about the present over a very long period of time, and being willing to say what you actually see without adding the usual softeners and qualifiers that make observations feel safer but less true. South Park has been doing that since August of 1997. The 6-day production cycle that Parker and Stone built their show around was not originally conceived as a tool for accurate cultural forecasting. It was conceived as a way to stay current, to be responsive, to engage with the world as it actually is rather than the world as it was 9 months ago when the scripts were written. But the side effect of that sustained responsiveness across 338 episodes and 28 seasons turned out to be a kind of cultural map of remarkable accuracy drawn in real time, covering nearly 30 years of American life. The predictions we've talked about tonight are entries on that map. Some of them are tiny, a throwaway line about a cruise ship, a joke about a restaurant's food quality, a background commercial parody. Some of them are significant, a full satirical dramatization of the mechanics of a presidential election 14 months before the election. Some of them are unsettling, a portrait of a celebrity's private self that turned out to be accurate 2 years before the private self became public. Some of them are genuinely strange, a 1999 cartoon about location tracking toys that described, in functional terms, the experience of playing Pokemon Go in 2016. What they share is this. They are all the product of looking honestly at something, following its logic without adding wishful thinking, and putting the result on screen. That's the method. And the method, applied for long enough and consistently enough, produces a body of work that contains a surprising amount of accurate description of things that hadn't happened yet when the description was written. There's a kind of quiet encouragement in that observation, if you let yourself receive it. Not the alarming kind, not the kind that suggests the world is more controlled or more scripted than it is, but the kind that suggests that the world is more knowable than it can sometimes feel, that the patterns in it are real and traceable and visible to those who are paying genuine attention. That clarity is a form of readiness, and readiness is a form of comfort even when what you're ready for is complicated. Trey Parker and Matt Stone started making South Park in a small room with construction paper in 1997. They've been doing it ever since, art through every kind of world event and cultural shift and political upheaval and technological transformation that those 28 years have produced. They've done it 6 days at a time, every time, showing up and looking honestly at whatever the week has brought and putting what they see on screen. And the show that resulted from all that showing up contains, scattered throughout its 338 episodes, more accurate descriptions of the future than probably any other creative work in the history of American television. That's the story. That's what South Park's predictions actually are. Not prophecy, not conspiracy, not special knowledge. Just clear, consistent observation of the present, sustained over an extraordinary period of time, expressed in the form of a cartoon that has been willing to say what it sees. And even when saying it out loud was uncomfortable, even when it turned out to be right in ways that nobody particularly wanted it to be right about. It's a good story for the end of a long evening, I think, because it's ultimately a story about what happens when you pay attention. When you look clearly and follow what you see and trust the observation more than you trust the polite alternative version of it. The world rewards that kind of attention. It confirms it, eventually, sometimes quickly, sometimes over decades. But the confirmation tends to come. There are 2 more items worth adding to the account before we close, because they came up in the research and because each one adds a different kind of texture to what we've been looking at all evening. These are shorter than some of the earlier examples, but they're precise in their own ways, and precision is one of the things that makes this particular body of predictions worth examining closely. The first involves Donald Trump again, but from a completely different angle than the presidential election prediction we looked at the start of the evening. This one is not about the broad shape of a political movement or the trajectory of a campaign. It's about a tweet, specifically the kind of tweet that a sitting president would post about a nuclear-armed adversary, and the South Park episode that parodied that exact kind of communication 2 days before a real version of it arrived. Season 21, Episode 2, September 27th, 2017. The episode is called Put It Down, and it is primarily about the boys of South Park becoming absorbed in the cultural anxiety around the relationship between the Trump administration and North Korea, specifically the pattern of the president communicating about nuclear matters through posts on Twitter. The episode satirizes this communication style directly, parodying the specific tone, the grandiose informality, the sense of nuclear consequence delivered through a social media platform that characterized the real dynamic between Trump's Twitter account and the ongoing North Korean situation in the autumn of 2017. The episode aired on September 27th, 2017. 2 days later, the real situation it was parodying produced content that made the episode look prescient in an unusually tight window. The episode had anticipated the specific mode of communication, the specific tone, and the specific diplomatic through social media dynamic, and that dynamic confirmed itself within 48 hours of broadcast. This is, by the standards of the show's history, one of the fastest turnarounds in the record, 2 days from satirical parody to real-world confirmation. It also sits alongside the holiday special example we talked about, which aired the same night and produced its own 48-hour confirmation as part of what was, by any measure, one of the more remarkably timed weeks in South Park's history. The Trump Twitter prediction doesn't involve any particular foresight about events that hadn't happened yet. It involves the show's characteristic practice of observing something that was happening in real time, and following it to its logical extension, and then having real events oblige by producing that extension almost immediately. It's the shortest gap between episode and confirmation in this account, and it rounds out the picture in an interesting way. The show's predictions span timelines from 48 hours to nearly 20 years, from a single throwaway line to a full satirical dramatization of a political movement. The range is part of what makes the pattern so interesting to look at as a whole. The second item I want to mention is a bit different from everything else on the list because it's not a prediction about a specific event or a specific person. It's a prediction about a feeling, about a psychological mood in the culture. And the reason it belongs here is that it turned out to be an accurate description of a mood that the culture would develop fully only several years after the episode it appeared in. Season 20, Episode 1. The season premiered on September 14th, 2016, in the weeks before the presidential election. The season was built around a number of interconnected themes, and one of the most prominent was a concept the show introduced called the member berries, small, sentient pieces of fruit that whispered nostalgic memories into the ears of anyone who consumed them, producing a kind of warm, uncritical longing for the past. The member berries would recall old things, beloved things, familiar things from earlier decades, and the people who consumed them would be flooded with pleasant feelings of recognition and comfort, and would increasingly prefer those feelings to the more complicated and demanding feelings associated with engaging with the present. The member berries were a satire of nostalgia as a political and cultural force, of the way the appeal to a remembered or imagined past can become a substitute for engaging with the actual present or the actual future. They were specifically in the 2016 season connected to the Trump campaign's appeal to the Make America Great Again formulation, which is structurally a call to nostalgia, a promise of return to a previous condition rather than a vision of a genuinely different future. This was sharp and timely commentary in 2016 because the election of that year was taking place. But the member berries' cultural life didn't end when the season did. The concept resonated in ways that extended beyond the election. The phrase member berries entered common usage in some corners of internet culture as a shorthand for exactly the kind of uncritical nostalgia the episode was satirizing. And the broader observation the season was making about nostalgia as a political mechanism, about the psychological comfort of the familiar past as a mobilizing force in a confusing present, became an increasingly widely discussed analytical framework in political science, cultural commentary, and media analysis in the years following 2016. The observation wasn't unique to South Park. Cultural analysts and political scientists had been writing about nostalgia as a political force for years before the 2016 season. But South Park's particular formulation of it, the member berries as a vivid and specific representation of the mechanism, and the season's sustained engagement with the way nostalgia functions in political environments, arrived at a moment that made the observation land with particular force. And the conversation about nostalgia as a political and cultural mechanism has continued to develop and deepen in the years since, in ways that suggest the season was engaging with something that had considerably more runway than a single election cycle. The member berries are not a prediction in the same sense as the Chinpokomon surveillance observation or the Where My Country Gone electoral anticipation. They're more like an identification of a concept and a naming of a thing that was already present. That turned out to be a concept the culture needed and continued to need in the years after the season that introduced it. That's a different kind of accuracy than a specific forecasting of events, but it belongs in this account because the kind of attention that produces specific accurate predictions also produces accurate identifications of the mechanisms that make events happen in the first place. And that, I think, is the right place to leave the predictions, with the mechanisms. With the observation that what South Park has demonstrated across nearly 30 years and across the full range of examples we have looked at tonight is not a gift for seeing the future, but a capacity for seeing the present clearly enough to describe its natural consequences. The predictions are byproducts of clarity. They happen because the show looks honestly. They happen because the show says what it sees. And what it sees, again and again, turns out to be something the world eventually confirms. That's the note to carry out of tonight, if you're carrying anything. The honest attention. The willingness to follow what you observe to its honest conclusion without adding the softening layers that make things feel safer but less true. It's a practice, and it's a difficult one. And South Park has been practicing it every week for nearly 3 decades. The predictions are the receipts for that practice. 30 years of showing up and looking clearly, and the world showing up in return. And then there is the Brokeback Mountain one. It's one of the stranger entries in the list when you consider just how far ahead of reality it landed. And it's worth giving it a moment of its own before we close. Season 2, Episode 9. August 19th, 1998. The episode is called Chef's Chocolate Salty Balls, and it's primarily about the Sundance Film Festival setting up in South Park and disrupting the town with its particular cultural atmosphere. The episode has a lot going on, and it holds up well as an example of the show's early ability to find comedy in the specific textures of late 1990s American cultural life. But the moment that matters for tonight is brief and easy to miss. At one point during the episode, Cartman complains about independent cinema. He says in the dismissive, exasperated tone that is one of his defining characteristics, that all independent movies are about gay cowboys eating pudding. It's a throwaway line, an exaggeration for comedic effect. A joke about what Cartman perceives as the pretensions of serious cinema, rendered in his characteristically reductive way. Nobody watching the episode in August of 1998 was expected to receive it as anything other than exactly what it appeared to be, a quick joke about a genre of film. 7 years later, in 2005, Ang Lee's film Brokeback Mountain was released. It is a careful, beautifully crafted, and deeply serious film about 2 men who develop a romantic relationship over the course of several decades against the backdrop of the American West, specifically involving cattle ranching and open-range work. It won 3 Academy Awards at the 78th ceremony in March of 2006. Best Director for Ang Lee, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Original Score. It was named by numerous critics as the best film of 2005. In 2018, it was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry as a culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant work. Cartman had described in a joke in August of 1998 a film about gay cowboys. Brokeback Mountain, a film about men who work with cattle in the American West and who have a romantic relationship, arrived 7 years later and won 3 Academy Awards. The pudding element did not feature, but the gay cowboys did. What makes this particular example sit strangely, even compared to the other items in this list, is the combination of the distance in time and the specificity of the image. Most of the predictions on this list involve trends, trajectories, systems, and patterns that were already in motion when the show identified them. The Brokeback Mountain prediction doesn't quite work that way. Ang Lee had not made or announced Brokeback Mountain in August of 1998. Annie Proulx had published the original short story in The New Yorker in 1997. So the source material existed, but it was not a widely known or anticipated project. There was no visible trajectory in 1998 that pointed toward a 1998 gay cowboys joke becoming an Academy Award-winning film in 2005. It's the kind of coincidence that is hard to explain cleanly, and I think it's worth acknowledging that not every entry in this list comes with a tidy explanation. Some of them are the result of careful observation and honest analysis. Some of them are the result of following a cultural trajectory to its conclusion. And some of them, possibly including this one, are just strange coincidences that gain their particular quality from the length of the period between the joke and the reality, and from the specific way the joke and the reality rhyme. 7 years is a long time to wait for a punchline. But the punchline arrived carrying 3 Academy Awards with it. The full list we've covered tonight, from Chin Pokemon in 1999 to the Trump tweets in 2017, from the Gay Cowboys of 1998 to the Carnival Poop Cruise of 2013, from the Jared Fogle structural prediction of 2002 to the Columbus statue argument of 2020, covers more than 2 decades of predictions across an enormous range of subjects. It timelines and mechanisms. Some arrived in 48 hours, some took 2 decades. Some were the product of careful satirical analysis. Some were throwaway lines in background news segments. All of them, when the real world caught up to where the episode had already gone, became part of the same larger story. A show that looked honestly at the world for a very long time, and a world that kept confirming what the show had seen. What South Park has demonstrated across nearly 30 years and across this full range of examples is not a gift for seeing the future, but a capacity for seeing the present clearly enough to describe its natural consequences. The predictions are byproducts of that clarity. They happen because the show looks without softening, because it follows what it observes to wherever the logic goes. If Parker and Stone kept showing up week after week, treating the 6-day cycle as a discipline rather than a burden, and bringing the same attentiveness to week 40 of one season as they brought to week 1 of the very first. 338 episodes, 28 years, and scattered throughout that body of work, more accurate descriptions of things that hadn't happened yet than any other single creative voice in American television history. There is something quietly wonderful in the contradiction at the heart of all this. A show built on noise and irreverence and a complete refusal to be polite that turns out, when you look at it fully, to be one of the most carefully attentive things on television. The loudness and the clarity aren't opposites. The provocation is the method. The accuracy is what the method produces. When applied honestly for long enough, that's a good thing to carry into sleep. The world has a shape, and the shape can be read by those willing to look at it without flinching. Take care of yourself.